When I walked into my stepson's room that night, I wasn't prepared for what I'd see. His gaze was intense, unrelenting, and in that moment, everything began to unravel. What happens when forbidden emotions blur the lines of family? And how long can secrets be kept in the shadows before they ignite a fire? Before we unravel this tangled web of desire and deception, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more captivating stories like this. Share where you're watching from in the comments below, and stay tuned as we dive into this unforgettable tale. When I walked into my stepson's room that night, I wasn't prepared for what I'd see. The soft glow of his bedside lamp lit up the room just enough to cast shadows against the walls. He was sitting on the edge of his bed, his head bent low, hands clasped, as if deep in thought. At first, I thought he might have been upset or tired, but then he looked up. His eyes met mine, and for a moment, neither of us said a word. It wasn't the expression I expected. There was something in it that made my breath hitch. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like the air shifted between us in a way that shouldn't have happened. "I didn't mean to disturb you," I managed to say, breaking the silence. My voice wavered, betraying the tension building in my chest. He didn't respond right away, just studied me with those eyes that seemed far too mature for someone his age. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost disarming. "You're not disturbing me. I was just thinking. That's all he said, but it didn't feel like the truth. His gaze lingered a second too long, and I felt an inexplicable heat rise in my cheeks. I stepped back toward the door, my hand gripping the frame for balance. "Good night," I murmured, trying to keep my tone even. He nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Good night, Mary." The way he said my name was different than usual, like a secret was buried in the syllables. I walked away quickly, the echo of his voice still ringing in my ears. In my own room, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall. My husband's suitcase was in the corner, untouched since he'd returned from his last trip. He was sound asleep, his soft snores filling the room, oblivious to the storm swirling in my chest. My hands trembled slightly as I smoothed the blanket beneath me, trying to rationalize what had just happened. It was nothing, I told myself, a trick of my mind, a misunderstanding. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just stepped onto a path I wouldn't be able to turn back from. I lay awake for hours that night, my mind replaying the moment in his room. Every glance, every word felt like it carried more weight than it should have. And beneath the guilt and confusion, there was something else, a flicker of excitement, of something I couldn't name but knew I had no right to feel. As the hours passed and dawn began to break, I realized that my world had shifted in ways I didn't fully understand yet. I just knew that whatever this was, it wasn't over. The morning after that unsettling encounter, I tried to shake off the lingering tension. I told myself it was just an odd moment, a mix of my overactive imagination and the exhaustion of juggling too many responsibilities. My husband had already left for work by the time I woke up, his usual coffee cup rinsed and drying by the sink. His absence was routine by now, though it didn't make the house feel any less empty. When I went downstairs, I found my stepson already sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone. The sight of him made my stomach twist uncomfortably. His hair was still messy from sleep, and the faint scruff on his jawline was more noticeable in the morning light. It was a reminder of how much he'd changed while away at college. He wasn't the same lanky teenager who'd moved in years ago. He was a man now, in both presence and demeanor, and that realization unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. "Morning," he said, looking up from his phone. His voice was light, casual, as though nothing unusual had happened the night before. That should have been comforting, but it wasn't. I mumbled a quick "morning" in return, busying myself with making coffee to avoid his gaze. "Dad already left?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. His tone was neutral, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes that made me feel exposed, as if he could see right through the polite facade I was desperately trying to maintain. "Yeah," I replied, keeping my focus on the coffee maker. He had an early meeting. I could feel his gaze lingering on me, and it made my skin prickle. "You have plans today?" I asked, hoping to steer the conversation into safer territory. "Not really," he said, standing up and stretching. The movement drew my attention involuntarily, and I quickly averted my eyes. "Maybe I'll go for a run later. You?" "Oh, just errands, the usual," I said, forcing a smile as I turned to face him. His expression was unreadable, but there was a softness in his eyes that made me uneasy. It was the same look he'd given me last night, the one I couldn't quite decipher, but couldn't forget. "Need any help?" he asked, his tone casual but his words oddly intimate. There was no reason for me to feel flustered, yet I did. "No, I'm fine, but thanks," I said quickly, avoiding his gaze as I grabbed my coffee and moved to the far end of the kitchen. The distance felt necessary, though I wasn't sure if it was for his sake or mine. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but that unspoken tension lingered in the background, like a shadow that refused to be ignored. I kept myself busy with chores, errands, anything to distract myself from the thoughts swirling in my head. But every now and then I'd catch a glimpse of him sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone or heading out the door for his run, and that same unease would creep back in. Later that evening, I found myself alone in the living room. My husband had called to say he'd be working late, and my stepson was upstairs, presumably in his room. The quiet of the house was both a relief and a burden. It gave me space to think, but thinking was the last thing I wanted to do. I settled onto the couch with a glass of wine, hoping it would help me unwind. But as I sipped, my thoughts kept drifting back to him, the way he'd looked at me that morning, the way he'd said my name the night before. It all felt too deliberate, too intentional. But that was ridiculous, wasn't it? He was my stepson. Whatever I thought I'd seen or felt was just a projection of my own restless mind. As I sat there, trying to convince myself of this, I heard footsteps descending the stairs. A moment later, he appeared in the doorway, his hair still damp from a shower and his t-shirt clinging slightly to his chest. He hesitated for a moment, as if debating whether to join me, then stepped into the room. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, gesturing to the spot on the couch beside me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no reason to say no, but the idea of him sitting so close felt dangerous in a way I couldn't articulate. "Of course not," I said finally, forcing a casual smile as I gestured to the empty seat. He sat down, the couch dipping slightly under his weight. The space between us felt too small, the air too charged. "What are you watching?" he asked, glancing at the TV. "Just some show," I said, barely able to focus on the screen. My hands tightened around my wine glass, the coolness of the glass grounding me. "Nothing special." He nodded, his attention shifting from the TV to me. "You seem tense," he said, after a moment, his voice low and soft. "Everything okay?" I laughed nervously, shaking my head. "I'm fine. Just tired, I guess." "You sure?" His gaze was steady, searching, and it made my breath catch. For a moment, I thought I saw something in his expression, a flicker of vulnerability, or maybe curiosity, but I couldn't be sure. "You've seemed distracted lately." The comment caught me off guard. "I'm not distracted," I said quickly, too quickly. "I just have a lot on my mind." "Fair enough," he said, leaning back against the couch. But he didn't look away. and the weight of his gaze felt like a challenge, as if he was daring me to admit what was really bothering me. I couldn't, of course. I couldn't even admit it to myself. The silence between us stretched out heavy and unspoken. I wanted to say something, anything to break the tension, but no words came. All I could do was sit there, my heart racing and my thoughts spinning, as the line between us blurred just a little bit more. The days that followed felt like walking a tightrope over an abyss. Every interaction with my stepson carried an undercurrent of something unspoken, a tension I couldn't deny no matter how much I tried to rationalize it away. He seemed to be everywhere I turned, whether it was in the kitchen, brushing past me to grab a glass of water, or on the couch when I came to relax, always sitting just close enough that I felt the pull of his presence. One evening, I found him in the dining room, his laptop open and papers spread across the table. He looked up as I walked in, his expression lighting up with a warmth that caught me off guard. "Hey," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I was just about to make some tea. Want some?" His offer was so ordinary, so casual, that I almost laughed at myself for the way my pulse quickened. "Sure," I said, forcing a smile as I set down the stack of laundry I'd been carrying. He stood and moved into the kitchen, and I followed, unable to resist the magnetic pull of his presence. As he filled the kettle, I busied myself by tidying up the counter, though it didn't really need cleaning. The silence between us was comfortable at first, but then he spoke. "You seem happier these days," he said, his tone conversational, but his words laced with something deeper. "It's nice to see you smile more." I froze for a moment, caught off guard by the observation. "Do I?" I asked, glancing at him over my shoulder. He nodded, his gaze steady and unwavering. "Yeah, it's like you're finally, I don't know, letting yourself relax." His words struck a chord I hadn't realized existed. My life had been so tightly wound for years between my husband's constant absences and the demands of running a household. I'd forgotten what it felt like to simply exist. But his comment wasn't just about me. It was about the way he saw me. And that realization sent a ripple of warmth through me that I couldn't ignore. "Thank you," I said softly, turning back to the counter to hide the flush rising in my cheeks. "That's sweet of you to say." He didn't respond right away, and when I finally turned back to look at him, I found him watching me with an intensity that made my breath hitch. The kettle began to whistle, breaking the spell, and he turned away to pour the tea. I took the moment to collect myself, but the warmth in my chest lingered, a quiet ache that refused to fade. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the moment in my mind. I told myself it was harmless, just a kind gesture from someone who cared. But the way he'd looked at me, the way his voice had softened when he spoke, felt like more than kindness. It felt like a question I wasn't ready to answer. The next day, I decided to put some distance between us. I left the house early, spending the morning running errands and the afternoon visiting a friend. By the time I returned, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the living room. My stepson was there, sprawled on the couch with a book in his hands. He looked up as I walked in, his face breaking into a smile that made my heart flutter. "Busy day?" he asked, setting the book aside. "Something like that," I replied, trying to keep my tone light. "Just needed to get out for a bit." He nodded, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Concern, maybe, or curiosity. "I was starting to think you were avoiding me," he said, his tone teasing but his gaze searching. The comment caught me off guard, and I laughed nervously. "Don't be ridiculous. Why would I do that?" He shrugged, his smile softening. "I don't know. Just feels like you've been distant lately." His words hung in the air between us, and I didn't know how to respond. He wasn't wrong. I had been distant, but only because being close to him felt like walking a line I wasn't sure I could trust myself not to cross. "I've just had a lot on my mind," I said finally, my voice quieter than I intended. "Anything you want to talk about?" he asked, his tone genuine and his expression open. For a moment, I considered telling him the truth. Not the whole truth, of course, but enough to ease the weight on my chest. But then I remembered who he was and who I was, and the thought of voicing even a fraction of my feelings made my stomach churn. "No," I said, shaking my head. "It's nothing." He looked like he wanted to press further, but he didn't. Instead, he nodded and leaned back against the couch, his gaze lingering on me a moment longer before returning to his book. That night I couldn't sleep. The house was quiet, save for the faint creak of the floorboards as I paced the living room. My thoughts were a tangled mess of guilt and longing, and no matter how hard I tried to sort through them, I couldn't find a way out. The boundary between us was becoming harder to define, and the thought of what might happen if we crossed it filled me with equal parts fear and desire. As I stood by the window, staring out into the darkened street, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to find him standing in the doorway, his expression soft and unreadable. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice low. I shook my head, my heart pounding in my chest. "No, just thinking." He stepped into the room, his movements slow and deliberate. "Want some company?" His question was simple, but it carried a weight that made my breath catch. I wanted to say no, to tell him to go back to bed, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I nodded, and he crossed the room to stand beside me. For a while we stood in silence, the space between us charged with unspoken words. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You can talk to me, about anything." The sincerity in his voice brought tears to my eyes, and I turned to look at him, my chest tightening. "I know," I said, my voice trembling. "Thank you." He reached out then, his hand brushing against mine in a gesture that felt both innocent and intimate. The contact sent a jolt through me, and I pulled my hand away, the sudden movement breaking the moment. "I should go to bed," I said quickly, my voice barely steady. "Good night." He nodded, his gaze lingering on me as I turned and walked away. As I climbed the stairs, I could feel his eyes on my back, and I knew that whatever this was between us, it wasn't over. The next morning, the weight of the previous night's interaction hung heavily in the air. I tried to carry on as though nothing had happened, burying myself in chores and errands. My husband was due back that evening, and the thought of his return brought both relief and unease. I wanted him home, wanted his presence to act as a buffer between my stepson and me. But I couldn't ignore the nagging fear that even his presence might not be enough to stop this spiral. By the time my husband arrived, suitcase in hand and a tired smile on his face, I had steeled myself to act normal. I greeted him with a kiss on the cheek, avoiding his eyes as I helped him unpack and asked about his trip. His answers were the same as always: long meetings, exhausting dinners, and nothing particularly noteworthy. He didn't seem to notice my unease, and for a moment, I thought I might actually be able to put this behind me. But later that evening, as we sat in the living room watching a movie, my stepson came downstairs. He was wearing a casual t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair tousled like he'd just woken up from a nap. He greeted his father with the usual warmth, but when his eyes met mine, there was a flicker of something else, something that made my stomach twist. "Mind if I join?" he asked, his tone casual. "Of course not," my husband said, gesturing for him to sit. I tensed as he took the seat beside me, his proximity setting my nerves on edge. I could feel the heat of him, the faint brush of his arm against mine, and it took everything in me to keep my focus on the screen. The movie played on, but I couldn't concentrate. My husband's attention was fully absorbed, his occasional laughs a sharp contrast to the storm brewing inside me. Meanwhile, my stepson seemed almost too relaxed, his arm draped over the back of the couch, his body angled slightly toward me. It felt deliberate, and the longer it went on, the harder it was to ignore. Eventually, I excused myself, claiming I needed to get ready for bed. My husband nodded absent-mindedly, his eyes still on the screen, but my stepson's gaze followed me as I left the room. I could feel it, like a physical weight, and it made my pulse race. Upstairs, I splashed cold water on my face, hoping it would help clear my mind. I stared at my reflection in the mirror, my thoughts a tangled mess of guilt, fear, and something I didn't want to name. I had to put an end to this. Whatever was happening between us, it couldn't continue. I wouldn't let it. I was about to head back to my bedroom when I heard a soft knock at the door. My heart leapt into my throat as I turned to see him standing there, his expression hesitant but determined. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to say no, but then I nodded, stepping aside to let him in. He closed the door behind him, his movements slow and deliberate, and suddenly the small space felt suffocating. "I don't know how to say this," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "but I can't keep pretending nothing's happening." I shook my head, my hands tightening into fists at my sides. "Nothing is happening," I said firmly, though my voice betrayed my own doubt. "We're just confused." "Are we?" he asked, stepping closer. His eyes searched mine, and the intensity of his gaze made it hard to breathe. "Because I'm not confused, Mary. I know how I feel." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, and for a moment I couldn't speak. When I finally found my voice, it was barely above a whisper. "This isn't right. You know that." "I don't care," he said, his tones soft but resolute. "I know it's complicated. I know it's messy. But I can't just ignore this. Can you?" I wanted to say yes, to tell him that I could and would ignore it, that I had to. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I looked away, my chest tightening as tears pricked at the corners of my eyes. He reached out then, his hand brushing lightly against mine. The contact sent a jolt through me, and I pulled away, stepping back as though the distance could somehow make this easier. "You need to go," I said, my voice shaking. "Please." He hesitated, his expression torn, but then he nodded. "Okay," he said softly, "but this isn't over." When he left, I sank onto the edge of the bed, my head in my hands. I felt like I was drowning, caught between what I knew was right and the emotions I couldn't seem to control. I didn't know how to fix this, or if it even could be fixed. The next morning, I avoided him completely. I left the house early, not bothering to leave a note or tell anyone where I was going. I spent the day driving aimlessly, my thoughts a chaotic mess. By the time I returned home, it was late and the house was quiet. My husband was already asleep, and I was grateful for the reprieve. But as I climbed the stairs, I heard a soft sound from the living room, a faint creak of the couch, followed by a low murmur. Curious, I tiptoed back down, peeking around the corner. There he was, sitting on the couch, his phone in hand. He looked up as if sensing my presence, his eyes locking onto mine in the dim light. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice soft. I hesitated, then shook my head. "No." "Me neither," he said, setting his phone aside. "Do you want to talk?" I wanted to say no, to walk away and put as much distance between us as possible, but instead, I found myself stepping into the room, my feet moving as if of their own accord. I sat down on the far end of the couch, keeping as much space between us as possible. We talked then, about everything and nothing. It felt like a return to normalcy, like we could pretend for just a little while that the tension wasn't there. But when the conversation lulled, the silence that followed was deafening. "I don't want to lose this," he said suddenly, his voice breaking the quiet. "Whatever it is." I looked at him, my heart aching at the vulnerability in his expression. "We can't," I said, my voice trembling. "It's not fair to anyone." He nodded, though his eyes were filled with pain. "I know, but that doesn't make it any easier." "No, it doesn't," I admitted, tears spilling over as I looked away. "But it's what we have to do." That night we said goodbye, not with words, but with the distance we forced between us. And though it broke my heart, I knew it was the only way to save the fragile balance of the life we'd built. In the days that followed, things returned to normal, or as close to normal as they could. My husband never suspected a thing, and my stepson and I found a way to coexist without crossing the line again. But every now and then, I'd catch him looking at me, or feel his presence too keenly. And I'd remember the spark, the temptation, and the choice that changed everything.